Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's Sutta class. We will start, as usual, with the Namo Tassa. Feel free to join if you like. Namo Tassa Bhagavato Arahato Samma Sambuddhassa. Namo Tassa Bhagavato Arahato Samma Sambuddhassa. Namo Tassa Bhagavato Arahato Samma Sambuddhassa. Buddhang Dhammang Sanghang Namasami. So, welcome to today's Sutta class. Today we are continuing to read the Potaliya Sutta, Majjhima Nikaya number 54. And this is a sutta that we started last time already. And today, hopefully, we can finish it. And for those of you who've been there last week, I hope you remember the story. This is about somebody called Potaliya in conversation with the Buddha. And Potaliya was somebody who was a householder, but he believed that he had already made a very, very strong commitment to renunciation. And he believed that he was already a renunciant, a spiritual practitioner. And so what he had actually done is he had handed over the inheritance to his children. So he had handed over the business and the household to his children. And so he believed that he had already cut off what he calls the cutting off of all affairs. So he thought that he had already let go of all attachments and that he no longer was in any way involved with, any kind of material attachments with the sensual world, that he already had made a very, very deep spiritual commitment and let go basically of all attachments to the material world, that he was a very accomplished spiritual practitioner. And so he had actually visited the Buddha, and he didn't look for any kind of spiritual teachings. He was just there trying to pick a fight, basically. So he was very arrogant. He just went to the Buddha to provoke some kind of spiritual debate. And of course, the Buddha saw through this, and the Buddha managed to find a way to talk to him, find an opening in his mind so that the Buddha could start teaching him a little bit of Dhamma. And so he took up that point that Potaliya had made about cutting off all attachments, or how Potaliya said the cutting off of affairs. And the Buddha said, well, yeah, you have already let go a little bit. You have already transferred some of your material assets to your children. So this is some kind of cutting off of affairs, but actually there is a lot more to be done. And so the Buddha managed to get Potaliya to listen to him and to transform this very antagonistic approach. And so the Buddha taught him 8 principles that Potaliya could practice in order to cut off his affairs fully, so to fully overcome samsara. And so Potaliya got a little bit interested in the Buddha's teaching, and he asked for more instructions. And then the Buddha taught those 8 principles in a lot of detail. And then they came to the point where the Buddha said, well, now I've explained it in detail, but even if you practice this way, there is you still haven't fully achieved it entirely and in all ways. So there is still more that I could teach you. And at that point, last time we stopped. And of course, at that point, now Potaliya is asking for the final teachings for going all the way to arahantship. And that is where we're going to keep on reading today. And what follows now is a very, very famous list of very beautiful and very vivid similes for the dangers in sensual pleasures. This is very, very famous. It's very often referenced in other suttas. It's also referenced in the Vinaya and in many other texts because we see many other monastics referring to this list, especially if there is somebody who is misbehaving. Then the other monastics will come and will tell them, don't you remember these similes? Don't you remember all these very vivid teachings? How the Buddha told us that there's so much danger in the way that you're behaving? So this is something we see a lot in other suttas and also in the Vinaya. And even in the texts such as the Theragatha and the Therigatha, which are collections of poems, actually, of the ancient monks and the ancient nuns in the Buddha's time, where they describe their progress towards arahantship and their lifestyle and the way that they practiced. It's very often that they reference these similes because they seem to have made a very, very big impact on the early Sangha because they're so easy to understand and to memorize. So this is what we're going to have a look at today. And I have put a link in the live chat to Bhikkhu Bodhi's translation. It should take you right to the place where we stopped last time. For those of you who are reading with the book, this is paragraph 14 in Bhikkhu Bodhi's translation. And we will just, get right into the sutta now. And there, the Buddha just finished his detailed description, and he said, "These 8 things that lead to the cutting off of affairs in the Noble One's discipline have now been expounded in detail. But the cutting off of affairs in the Noble One's discipline has not yet been achieved entirely and in all its ways." So the Buddha is telling Potaliya that actually there's still more that he could teach him. And so, of course, at this point now, Potaliya is interested. And Potaliya says, "Venerable Sir, how is the cutting off of affairs in the Noble One's discipline achieved entirely and in all ways? It would be good, Venerable Sir, if the Blessed One would teach me the Dhamma, showing me how the cutting off of affairs in the Noble One's discipline is achieved entirely and in all ways." "Then listen, householder, and attend closely to what I shall say." "Yes, Venerable Sir," Potaliya the householder replied. The Blessed One said this: "Householder, suppose a dog, overcome by hunger and weakness, was waiting by a butcher's shop. Then a skilled butcher or his apprentice would toss the dog a well-hacked, clean-hacked skeleton of meatless bones smeared with blood. What do you think, householder? Would that dog get rid of his hunger and weakness by gnawing such a well-hacked, clean-hacked skeleton of meatless bones smeared with blood?" "No, Venerable Sir." "Why is that?" "Because that was a skeleton of well-hacked, clean-hacked, meatless bones smeared with blood. Eventually, that dog would reap only weariness and disappointment." So too, householder, a noble disciple considers thus: sensual pleasures have been compared to a skeleton by the Blessed One. They provide much suffering and much despair, while the danger in them is great. Having seen this thus as it actually is, with proper wisdom, he avoids the equanimity that is diversified based on diversity and develops the equanimity that is unified based on unity, where clinging to the material things of the world utterly ceases without remainder. So this is the simile of the skeleton, the famous simile of the skeleton, and it talks about a dog. And the dog is very hungry and he is waiting by a butcher's shop. So obviously the dog knows where to go to get some sustenance, some nourishment, some food. Obviously he would like to have some meat there. But all he gets from that butcher is a bone that is already cleared of all the meat. It just is smeared a little bit with blood, and that is tossed to that dog. And so because it is smeared with blood, it smells delicious. And as the dog licks it, it also tastes delicious. So the dog gets some kind of pleasurable feeling out of this. But because there is no actual meat on that bone, the dog doesn't get any kind of lasting satisfaction. And his problem, the hunger and weakness, isn't solved in any way by gnawing on that bone, that meatless bone that is just smeared with blood. And so this is the first simile for sensual pleasures. So they seem very pleasurable, they seem very delicious, they seem very appealing and enticing, but actually what we get is not any kind of lasting pleasure out of them. Sensual pleasures are very fleeting, they're very impermanent, and they do not actually solve our fundamental underlying problem that we have, that is the problem of suffering. So it seems to us that the sensual pleasure, because we get pleasure, that should solve the problem of our suffering. But actually, it's just entirely empty, just like that bone with a bit of blood on it, without any, which doesn't have meat and thus doesn't nourish the dog. In the same way, sensual pleasures cannot actually address the problem that we have, the problem of suffering. It's just sort of covers up the suffering for a very brief moment, in the same way that the blood seems like it might actually provide some sustenance to the dog. But fundamentally, they cannot in any way address the unsatisfactoriness and the suffering that we experience in our life. And so the Buddha says, a follower of the Buddha, a noble disciple, thinks about this, and they realize that there's so much suffering and so much despair that comes with the indulgence of sensual pleasures. It seems like they're pleasurable, but actually they just lead to more suffering. So we have them for a brief moment and then they're gone. So the suffering comes back. They haven't actually solved our problem. And then also the reflection is that the danger in them is great. So because we indulge in them, we actually strengthen all the defilements that we have in our mind. We actually strengthen all the greed. We strengthen all the delusion because we crave for those pleasures. And as we indulge in them, that gets worse and worse, those defilements. So afterwards, we're worse off than we were before. So there is a lot of danger in indulging in those pleasures. That is the reflection that somebody would do, who is a follower of the Buddha. And then the Buddha sees, when they really deeply see this with wisdom, according to reality, then, as the Buddha says, they avoid the equanimity that is diversified based on diversity and develop the equanimity that is unified based on unity, where clinging to the material things of the world utterly ceases without remainder. And so this refers to pretty high stages on the development of the path already. So this refers to quite high samadhi stages. So the equanimity that is diversified based on diversity, this refers to the practice of the fourth jhana. So in the fourth jhana, we know that we have that equanimity is the predominant experience that we have in our mind. So from the first to the third jhana, we have piti and sukha, so rapture and pleasure, or only pleasure in the third jhana where rapture has already ceased. But in the fourth jhana, all these pleasurable experiences have completely vanished, and we experience mental equanimity and bodily neutral feeling. So complete equanimity, both on the bodily and on the mental level. But still, that equanimity is diversified because the fourth jhana still belongs to the fine material plane. So this is still a plane that belongs, that has a material experience, even though it's a fine material experience. So unlike our ordinary experience where we experience matter as like the gross physical matter, that has already ceased in jhanas, obviously, but fine material matter is still there. So beings that live in jhana realms, they have bodies that are made of light. Light obviously has very subtle matter that is associated with it. In modern physics, we call them photons. So all these things are still there. So they are much subtler than our gross bodies, but there is still material experience. And for that reason, perceptions are still diversified in that state. But when you move on from the fourth jhana to the immaterial realms, then because these are immaterial realms, as the name says, we overcome all attachment to the material world. And at that point, the equanimity that persists from the fourth jhana to all the higher stages, so to the immaterial realms, that equanimity then is unified. And so so in the immaterial realms, as I think most people will know, there are 4 stages in the immaterial realms, from the base of infinite space, through the base of infinite consciousness to the base of nothingness and the base of neither perception or non-perception. These are the immaterial realms. All these are just based on equanimity, and on the one single unified perception of that particular base. So either of infinite space or infinite consciousness or nothingness, or neither perception or non-perception and nothing else. There, the mind is really entirely stable and unified, and there's nothing else except for that one perception. And I'm sure most of you are familiar with this transition, like the description in the suttas, obviously, maybe not the actual experience, but the description in the suttas, the transition from the fourth jhana into the immaterial realms. And that is a standard passage that recurs over and over in the suttas. And the standard, I would just read this from another sutta, so we can talk about it. And the standard passage is, in order to enter into an immaterial attainment, the standard passage is, with the complete surmounting of perceptions of form, with the disappearance of perceptions of sensory into perceptions of diversity, aware that space is infinite, the practitioner enters upon and abides in the base of infinite space. So it is already built in the standard description of that passage from the fourth jhana into the first immaterial realm, the base of infinite space. It is already described that at this point, we completely surmount all perceptions of form, including fine material form. That means at this point, we really let go of all attachments to material form, to matter. And then the description says the disappearance of perceptions of sensory impact. Of course, there's no more sensory impact if we have no more senses, because we have no more body. And then the non-attention to perceptions of diversity. So our perceptions of diversity also cease at this point. So in the fourth jhana, we still can have those what is called perceptions of diversity, even though, of course, the mind is very stable and very equanimous already. So it wouldn't be like completely wild, lots of different things impacting on the mind. The mind would already be quite still, but we can still perceive a diversity of things. When we enter the immaterial realm, that completely ceases. And that is built in the standard description of how to enter these immaterial realms. So at that point, clinging to material things of the world utterly ceases without remainder, as the Buddha says here. So this is what the Buddha talks about here, that entry into immaterial realms. And of course, that seems like a really, really high teaching to give to somebody like Potaliya, who is a householder and who doesn't have any kind of samadhi experience so far. And he is not a spiritual practitioner really, or renunciant, somebody who has made a lot of samadhi practices beforehand. So that is a really, really tough teaching to give to Potaliya. And I think the reason why the Buddha gives this teaching to him is because the one thing that Potaliya seems really invested in and really interested in is what he himself has called the cutting off of affairs. And of course, the cutting off of affairs, or in other words, the non-attachments to any kind of material things that necessarily involves entering into an immaterial realm. In order to overcome all attachment to matter, you have to overcome all matter and enter into the immaterial realm. And for that reason, the Buddha is teaching this to Potaliya at this point, at least to show him all the things that he is missing out on, because he is not aware of how deep the commitment to letting go has to be, and that the commitment he has made as a householder by far, is falling far short of what he could actually achieve. So to give him a vision of what is out there that he is missing out on. So that was the first simile, the simile of the skeleton. And then the Buddha moves on to the second simile, the simile of the piece of meat. And the Buddha says, householder, suppose a vulture, a heron, or a hawk seized a piece of meat and flew away. And then vultures, herons, and hawks pursued it and pecked and clawed it. What do you think, householder? If that vulture, heron, or hawk does not quickly let go of that piece of meat, wouldn't it incur death or deadly suffering because of that? Yes, Venerable Sir. So too, householder, a noble disciple considers thus: sensual pleasures have been compared to a piece of meat by the Blessed One. They provide much suffering and much despair, while the danger in them is great. Having seen this thus, as it actually is, with proper wisdom, That practitioner goes from the fourth jhana to the immaterial realm and then clinging to the material things of the world utterly cease without remainder. So this is the second simile, the famous simile of the piece of meat, where a bird has actually this time gotten hold of an actual piece of meat, not like the bone, and not like the dog who just got a bone, but this time they actually got a piece of food. And what has happened is that everybody else, all the other birds, got very jealous and got very agitated, and they got very violent, and they're all pursuing this one bird, trying to get that piece of meat, and they're attacking it, and that bird is being pecked at and stabbed and injured. And if that bird doesn't let go of that piece of meat quickly, it might really be seriously injured or even die. And again, this is a simile for sensual pleasures. So when we have something and it's very attractive, then of course other people and other beings also want to have this. So it gives rise to a lot of jealousy. It gives rise to a lot of angry feelings and angry emotions, and it gives rise even to a lot of violence. And I think we can experience that in our daily experience. Just, neighbors fighting with each other, or neighbors trying to, one up each other, and always having like a competition going. We can see that even with little children that are fighting over a toy. One child has a toy that seems very attractive to the other child, and then the other child tries to violently take that away, and it leads to a lot of screaming and a lot of tears and a lot of drama. And we can even see that on the world scale, where countries start wars with each other because they're fighting over some kind of resource or some kind of piece of land or something that seems attractive to one country and that they want to have. So this is really something that we can experience very easily. I think how those kind of sensual pleasures, sensually attractive things, can lead to a lot of danger and to a lot of suffering and a lot of despair. And again, we reflect on this, and then we develop a lot of equanimity, and eventually we really surpass all or overcome all attachment to the material, any kind of material form, even the most subtle form. So obviously we don't just overcome attachment to the fourth jhana, but we overcome attachment to all material forms, including even the fourth jhana. So the Buddha's point is not that the fourth jhana is especially dangerous, but that the fourth jhana, even the fourth jhana as the most subtle kind and the most pleasurable kind of material experience, also needs to be overcome. And we need to enter, we need to let go of all attachment, even to this most pleasant and most subtle state, such as the fourth jhana. Not to mention all the lower stages. So, and then the Buddha talks about the next simile, which is the simile of the grass torch. And he says, householders, suppose a man took a blazing grass torch and went against the wind. What do you think, householder? If that man does not quickly let go of that blazing grass torch, wouldn't that blazing grass torch burn his hand or his arm or some other part of his body, so that he might incur death or deadly suffering because of that? Yes, venerable sir. So too, householder and noble disciple considers thus. Sensual pleasures have been compared to a grass torch by the Blessed One. They provide much suffering and much despair, while the danger in them is great. Having seen this thus, as it actually is with proper wisdom, the practitioner overcomes the fourth jhana, enters immaterial stages, and clinging to the material things of the world utterly cease without remainder. So this is the simile of the grass torch. It's somebody holding on to a grass torch and going against the wind, so the flames get blown into their face or onto their body, and of course that will cause a lot of suffering. So again, they have a desirable object, a grass torch, a torch that will bring light and warmth in the darkness, in the night. But if you mishandle it, it will bring you a lot of suffering, a lot of despair, and can even kill you. And again, we reflect in the same way sensual pleasures can affect us negatively in this way, bring us a lot of suffering, bring us a lot of despair, and we realize that we need to let go of all this attachment. Then there is the simile of the charcoal pit, which is next. Householders, suppose there were a charcoal pit, deeper than a man's height, full of glowing coals, without flame or smoke. Then a man came who wanted to live and not to die, who wanted pleasure and recoiled from pain. And 2 strong men seized him by both arms and dragged him towards that charcoal pit. What do you think, householder? Would that man twist his body this way and that? Yes, venerable sir, why is that? Because that man knows that if he falls into that charcoal pit, he will incur death or deadly suffering because of that. And so too, householder, the noble disciple, considers in the usual way that sensual pleasures are dangerous and resolves to enter the immaterial plane and let go of all attachment. Yeah, so this is the simile of the charcoal pit. Obviously, it shows us that sensual pleasures are dangerous, that they can burn us, quite similar actually to that blazing grass torch. The charcoal pit, if we fall into the pit, obviously, then we'll suffer a lot. And it also brings out the trap of sensual pleasures. Like if you fall into that pit, it's like a trap. You've fallen in. It's really, really difficult to come out again. So it's like falling down into a hole in the same way, like we can fall down in this hole of sensual pleasures, and it's really, really difficult for us to free ourselves because the greed and the attachment and the delusion will be so strong. And of course, the more we indulge in it, the stronger it gets and the more difficult it gets to get out. And then the next simile is the simile of the dream. And that is the Buddha saying, householders, suppose a man dreamt about lovely parks, lovely groves, lovely meadows, and lovely lakes, and on waking he saw nothing of it. So too, householder, a noble disciple, considers thus sensual pleasures have been compared to a dream by the Blessed One. They provide much suffering and much despair, while the danger in them is great. And they reflect and so on and resolve to let go in the usual way. So here we have the simile of a dream. And of course, sensual pleasures are like a dream. We always imagine they would be so wonderful and so pleasurable and so delightful, and they will solve all our problems. And sometimes we don't even think about it at all. We just dream, like in a dream, on autopilot, just indulge in one pleasure or run after one pleasure after the other without even properly reflecting, just like somebody in a dream doesn't properly reflect. And we have all these imaginations of how great it will be, but actually at some point we wake up and we realize we have gained nothing at all, and we are still in the same kind of messed up psychological states as we were before. And we still experience the same kind of suffering that we had before. So it hasn't actually solved our existential problem, the problem of suffering and the problem of impermanence. So again, the noble disciple reflects and then resolves to attain the immaterial stages. And then the next simile is the simile of the borrowed goods. And the Buddha says, householders, suppose a man borrowed goods on loan, a fancy carriage and fine jeweled earrings, and preceded and surrounded by those borrowed goods, he went to the marketplace. Then people seeing him would say, sirs, that is a rich man. That is how the rich enjoy their wealth. Then the owners, whenever they saw him, would take back their things. What do you think, householder? Would that be enough for that man to become dejected? Yes, venerable sir, why is that? Because the owners took back their things. And so too, householder, a noble disciple, considers thus sensual pleasures have been compared to borrowed goods by the Blessed One. They provide much suffering and much despair, while the danger in them is great, and so on. So the simile of the borrowed goods really tells us that sensual pleasures are like taking a loan from the future. So now we might experience a quick dopamine hit. We might experience a few pleasurable sensations. So it might seem to us that it is actually worth it. And we might even reflect on it, and we might even know that in the future we have to pay this back with more suffering and more craving and with all the defilements that we have fostered in our mind, that we have let grow in our mind because we indulged in these things. So maybe we even know that in the future this will lead to harm, or maybe we haven't thought about it at all and didn't realize that all these defilements we are cultivating will lead to harm in the future. But it's really like a loan. We experience a quick pleasure now, but in the future this will lead to suffering, because we have strengthened the defilements in our mind. We have created bad karma, and eventually that karma will come and catch up with us. So it's like a borrowed good. Eventually, not only will we lose the pleasure, but we also will feel, as that man feels dejection because he had lost that pleasure and had to give it back to the owners. In the same way, we will also feel more despair in the future, because we have cultivated that bad karma. So, and then finally, there is the simile of the fruit on a tree. And the Buddha says, "Householder, suppose there were a dense grove not far from some village or town, within which there was a tree laden with fruit, but none of its fruit had fallen to the ground. Then a man came, needing fruit, seeking fruit, wandering in search of fruit. And he entered the grove and saw the tree laden with fruit. Thereupon he thought, 'This tree is laden with fruit, but none of its fruit has fallen to the ground. I know how to climb a tree, so let me climb this tree, eat as much fruit as I want, and fill my bag.' And he did so. Then a second man came, needing fruit, seeking fruit, wandering in search of fruit. And taking a sharp axe, he too entered the grove and saw that tree laden with fruit. Thereupon he thought, 'This tree is laden with fruit, but none of its fruit has fallen to the ground. I do not know how to climb a tree, so let me cut this tree down at its root, eat as much fruit as I want, and fill my bag.' And he did so. What do you think, householder, if that first man who had climbed the tree doesn't come down quickly when the tree falls, wouldn't he break his hand or his foot or some other part of his body, so that he might incur death or deadly suffering because of that? Yes, venerable sir. So too, householder, a noble disciple considers, thus sensual pleasures have been compared to fruits on a tree by the Blessed One. They provide much suffering and much despair, while the danger in them is great, and so on. So here we have the simile of the fruits on a tree, and two men or two persons. The first person comes and just wants some fruits, and they climb that tree and try to get fruits there. But then a second person comes along, and that second person also wants fruits, and they don't know how to climb that tree, so they just cut down the tree without any regard for that first person's life or for that first person's safety or even for the future, because if they cut down the tree, obviously there won't be any more fruit in the future. And so another person's actions can really impact on that first person. And so this is also something that we experience all the time, as long as we cling to material things. So even if we ourselves are good people, we are trying to do the right thing, we are keeping precepts, we are living a good life, we are not alone on this planet. There are a lot of other beings around us, and we cannot control other people's actions. So other people might be there, and they might be violent, and they might do a lot of stuff that impacts us and that really, really causes us a lot of harm and a lot of suffering. So as long as we cling to material things, even if we live a good life, because other people can impact us, we are liable to suffering, because other people can do a lot of stuff to us. And sooner or later, negative things will happen to us, because there are just so many beings around us, and many people are quite selfish, and they don't take other people too much into account, or they don't think too much about the future. And we can experience that in like very small things where people just really don't consider properly and harm us. Or we can even see that on the very big scale where people are destroying this entire planet. And with climate change and so on, and just environmental destruction and destruction of, which causes the destruction of livelihood for so many people, destruction of the habitat for so many animal species, and basically just might actually make our entire planet uninhabitable eventually. So as long as we have a material body, suffering is going to come, because we cannot control what other people are doing or what other beings are doing. And so the only solution to this problem fundamentally is to let go of all attachment to any kind of material object or material thing. Because in the immaterial realm, obviously there is no matter, and so other beings cannot impact each other. So this is the last simile. And as we have seen, all the similes try to say somewhat the same thing, to let go of sensual attachments or attachments to any kind of matter, including fine material matter. But they all come at it from a slightly different angle, and they bring in different perspectives. Sometimes they bring in other people and how they impact us. Sometimes they bring in how our craving causes harm, how other being, the jealousy of other people causes harm, or how hatred of other beings causes harm, or how it's just like a dream, or so on. So they provide many different angles and many different perspectives just to get this point across. And I think the Buddha is doing this, one, because it's very memorable to have so many similes, and because it's much easier to understand if it's repeated from different angles. And also because, as I mentioned, Potaliya is quite new to this. And this is a very high teaching about the immaterial realms. So the Buddha has to make it very clear and very plain to Potaliya so that he is able to grasp this teaching. And so far, what the Buddha has done is to guide Potaliya to understand how you overcome attachment to the material world, so to the sensual plane and to the fine material plane. And he has guided Potaliya how to get to the immaterial plane. So the base of infinite space, the base of infinite consciousness, the base of nothingness, and the base of neither perception nor non-perception. But even the immaterial plane is still within samsara. So this is still a rebirth. We still haven't overcome our attachment to samsara yet, because we're still attached to the immaterial realm. So to the mental aspect of our experience. And as long as we still have this attachment, we are not freed from samsara. We are not ultimately liberated from this round of rebirth and from suffering. So we haven't really fully developed the Buddhist path yet. So there is one last step that is missing, and this is what the Buddha now teaches about. So the Buddha says, based upon that supreme mindfulness whose purity is due to equanimity, this noble disciple recollects their manifold past lives. That is one birth, two births, three births, and so on. I think most of you will be familiar with this passage. And with their aspects and particulars, they recollect their manifold past lives. So what the Buddha is talking about now, he's starting to talk about the three higher knowledges, or specifically this, what I have read now, is the first of the three higher knowledges, in Pali called the Tevijja. And so with the higher knowledges, we are able to make that, to really deeply develop wisdom and deeply understand about the reality of samsara and make that breakthrough to arahantship. So to let go of this last bit of attachment that we still have. And in this first higher knowledge, we recollect our past lives. And if you remember the stock passage, we don't only recollect a few rebirths, we recollect hundreds of thousands, millions of rebirths. Eons of universes expanding and contracting, new universes coming into being and then disappearing and vanishing again, and all the rebirths as the various different beings that we have had during this extremely long span of time. So we really, really deeply understand about how rebirth works. And we have no more doubt about rebirth whatsoever. And we don't just like vaguely recollect some sort of random aspect of that rebirth, but we recollect all the aspects and particulars. And the stock passage usually says we recollect the name, the family, the food we have eaten, the pleasure and pain that we have experienced, the appearance that we had, so the body, how we look like. And we also remember how long we have lived, our lifespan, and we remember how we passed away, the death process, and then how we got reborn somewhere else. And in the next life, again, we recollect all the details. And so for a long, long string, all the lives for like immeasurable lengths of time, almost immeasurable lengths of time. So we have no more doubt about rebirth. And for that reason, that this is called the first higher knowledge. And this first higher knowledge, as the Buddha says, is based on the supreme mindfulness that emerges from this very deep samadhi that we have just practiced in the immaterial realms. The supreme mindfulness and the equanimity. And of course, equanimity, we have talked about equanimity the whole time. Equanimity is present in the fourth jhana and all the attainments upwards of the 4th jhana, so all the immaterial attainments as well. And based on this, because our mind is so pure and clear and still and equanimous, we can actually make these deep insights and see this first higher knowledge. And then the Buddha moves on to the second higher knowledge, and he says, based upon that same supreme mindfulness, whose purity is due to equanimity, with the divine eye, which is purified and surpasses the human, this noble disciple sees beings passing away and reappearing, inferior and superior, fair and ugly, fortunate and unfortunate, and they understand how beings pass on according to their actions. So this is the second higher knowledge. I think you're probably familiar with the stock passage, which was abbreviated here. And the second higher knowledge is about understanding how karma leads to different kinds of rebirths. So that karma is the process that drives rebirth, and that good karma leads to a good rebirth, and bad karma leads to a bad rebirth. And again, this is not something that this person has to take on faith or on trust in the Buddha, or that they somehow intellectually contemplate and then believe in, but they actually directly see how this process works. They can directly understand it, they look at it, and they have no more doubt about this because they make the direct experience at this point. For that reason, it becomes a higher knowledge. And then the third higher knowledge, of course, is the knowledge of the destruction of the taints, so the breakthrough to arahantship, to full liberation. And here the Buddha says, based upon that same supreme mindfulness, whose purity is due to equanimity, by realizing for themselves with direct knowledge, this noble disciple here now enters upon and abides in the deliverance of mind and deliverance by wisdom that are taintless with the destruction of the taints. So, of course, the destruction of the taints, the complete surmounting of all defilements of the mind, means the complete liberation from the round of rebirths, the liberation from samsara, which means arahantship. So at this point, obviously, you have completed the Buddhist path. You have let go of really all attachments whatsoever. And so the Buddha says, at this point, householder, the cutting off of affairs in the noble one's discipline has been achieved entirely and in all ways. What do you think, householder? Do you see in yourself any cutting off of affairs like this cutting off of affairs in the noble one's discipline, when it is achieved entirely and in all ways? So now that the Buddha has given Potaliya this very in-depth teaching, very profound teaching, he is coming back to Potaliya's original point where he had claimed that he had already cut off all his affairs. And he asked Potaliya, well, have you actually cut off all your affairs? And then, of course, Potaliya now has to admit that actually he has not cut off all his affairs. He obviously is not an arahant yet. He's very far from that stage. So Potaliya says, Venerable Sir, who am I that I should possess any cutting off of affairs entirely and in all ways, like that in the noble one's discipline? I am far indeed, Venerable Sir, from that cutting off of affairs in the noble one's discipline, when it has been achieved entirely and in all ways. So Potaliya at least has a little bit of wisdom, so we can now distinguish between what he has done and what actually the Buddha is describing, and he is honest enough to admit that actually he made a mistake and that he has not achieved this cutting off of affairs as he had previously thought. And he also has to admit now at this point that he is not actually a very accomplished spiritual practitioner, and he is not a renunciant. He is still very much a householder. And the time is already a little bit advanced, so I'm not going to read through the rest of the sutta. The rest of the sutta is just Potaliya saying that he made a mistake and that now he has a much better appreciation for Buddhist monastics, and that in future he will support Buddhist monastics a lot more, and he has a lot more reverence and respect for those monastics, and he will also support them with requisites and so on. And it also ends with a stock passage where Potaliya now takes refuge in the Buddha, the Dhamma, and the Sangha, and declares himself a lay follower for life. And again, this is really interesting because the sutta started out with Potaliya claiming that he was an accomplished renunciant. And now in the end here, he just says, well, actually, I'm a lay follower. And he refers also to himself as a lay follower and goes for refuge in the Buddha Dhamma Sangha as a lay follower. So again, we can really see how he has grown through this teaching and how he was able to accept that teaching and at least have a vision of what is possible, even though he himself probably isn't practicing it. He himself is going back to his lay life, but he has a vision of how you could potentially develop your mind and actually attain arahantship and cut off all affairs. So I think at this point, I am going to end the sutta discussion for today. And now if you have any questions or comments, please type them in the live chat and I will see if I can answer them. And I see that a few venerables have joined us today. Welcome to Buddhananda Mahathera. And I think also Ashin Visuddhananda is a monk. So it's really good to see you. Thank you for tuning in. And let's see if there is any question in the live chat. I see a lot of people saying sadhu and so on. Hello, Gita. It's nice to see you again. Seems like you're not working today, so it's good to see that you're joining in. Gita says she actually has to start working later. Okay. So somebody's tuning in from Bangladesh. That's really nice. And somebody is in China. Welcome to everyone. Good to see you all. People tuning in from everywhere in the world. And Sud has a question. Sorry, Melissa. Didn't mean to display this one. Yeah, okay. So Sud asks, what would you say the goal is for lay followers per the Buddha? Well, so it depends on your own aspirations, but the Buddha actually said, the Buddha actually gave us some role models that we should emulate. And so because there is a fourfold Sangha, so Buddhist monks, Buddhist nuns, and then male lay followers and female lay followers, the Buddha gave us 8 role models, 2 monks, 2 nuns, 2 male lay followers, and 2 female lay followers. And those are the ones that we should aspire to. And the Buddha says, as we practice, we should always think about those people and we should wish and aspire to becoming like them. So for the monks, they should aspire to become like Sariputta and Mahamoggallana, the 2 male chief disciples. The nuns should aspire to become like Kema and Upalavanna bhikkhunis, the female chief disciples. And then the layman should aspire to becoming like Chitta, the householder, and Hataka of Alavi. And the female lay disciples should aspire to become like Kuchuttara and Nandamata. And for those of you who don't know those people, I have actually taught a series on those role models for lay people. You can find them on the Buddhist Insights channel. It seems that all of them were very, very highly accomplished practitioners. Most of the lay people were actually non-returners, and they had very, very deep samadhi practices. Some of them even had psychic powers, and they had memorized a lot of teachings. They were very, very accomplished practitioners, while still not having gone forth, while still living a lay life. And so this is what the Buddha recommended that you aspire to: non-return and high samadhi practices and lots of learning in the suttas, very accomplished knowledge in suttas and the Buddha's teaching. So if you're looking for inspiration, then this is probably where you should start. Read their suttas, get to know them. And yeah, if you don't know them, then check out this series, because I put a lot of links there, and we explored each of those 4 disciples in one separate session. So we have quite a bit of material in there. Someone is tuning in from Chile. Hi, very good to see you. And somebody is from Sydney. Wonderful. And Sud asks for the names again. So I will just type them in the chat. So the names are, for the male lay followers, Chitta the householder and Hataka of Alavi. And for the female side, it's Kuch Uttara and Velukantaki Nandamata. So I will just quickly type this in the live chat. So Chitta the householder, Hataka of Alavi, Kuch Uttara, and Velukantaki Nandamata. And of course, this is missing the diacritical marks, but I think you should still be able to search for them and find them. So you can just search on Sutta Central, for example, or you just search on the Buddhist Insights YouTube channel, and you should be able to find this series of talks that I gave there. So it seems that Anagarika Sunya has posted half of a question. No, now I can see the other half. Okay, let's see. So Anagarika Sunya says, at this point of my life, I find one of my strongest attachments is to the welfare of my adult children. I recently accompanied my older daughter through cancer surgery observations for development of equanimity. Well, yeah, the Buddha said that, of course, being attached to family members is one of our strongest attachments. It's very difficult to overcome, especially mothers being attached to their children, of course, is difficult. So I think you're probably familiar with the Sutta, where the Buddha says that suffering and pain is born from those who are dear. This is a story in the Majjhima Nikaya where somebody has lost their child, a father has lost his son and comes to the Buddha, and the Buddha says, well, yeah, these attachments to loved ones can lead to a lot of pain and suffering. And that man got very angry, didn't understand the teaching, and complained about the Buddha and said, well, no, actually only happiness and joy come from family members, no pain and sorrow. And so the whole town of Savatthi was debating about this issue, and eventually it reached the court. And King Pasenadi and Queen Malika were discussing about this. And Malika at this point was a very strong follower of the Buddha, and King Pasenadi was not yet. So Malika sent somebody to the Buddha to get a more detailed explanation, and then she told the explanation to King Pasenadi. And so eventually King Pasenadi was also convinced, because Queen Malika then asked him to reflect what would happen if something happened to your daughter, Princess Vajiri. If she got sick, wouldn't you suffer? And he was like, yeah, I'd suffer. What would happen if something would happen to your son, Vidudaba? And again, the king said, well, I would really suffer if something happened to my son, Vidudaba. What would happen if something were to happen to me or to your other wife? Or even if you lost your kingdom, wouldn't you suffer? And so with all these reflections, the king was able to understand that, attachments to loved ones really leads to a lot of suffering. And so the only thing we can do really here is to reflect, to acknowledge that the attachments are there, and to reflect wisely, to reflect properly on how this is actually not beneficial for us. So we can still have love for our children, especially we can practice metta, we can practice mudita, we can practice compassion if the child is going through a difficult time, having cancer surgery or something. So we can practice the Brahma Viharas, but Brahma Viharas should be practiced without attachment. So we can still have very, very positive relations with our children and also with all other human beings and all other beings in general. But the attachment part of that really leads to suffering. So like with proper reflection, we can actually differentiate between what is the attachment that leads to suffering and what is the pure kind of love that will not make me suffer, because there's all the Brahma Viharas are present, including equanimity. So the most beneficial thing is to read suttas like this. There are many other suttas, many suttas like this, suttas where the sutta with King Munda, for example, where his queen had died and he was suffering so much and he was so distraught. And then I think Mahakachana, if I'm not mistaken, gives him a teaching about impermanence. So really properly reflecting, while at the same time not rejecting the children, but to practice the Brahma Viharas with them, I think is usually quite a good way to go. And of course, not to expect that you can let go your attachments straight away, because the attachment to family members is very strong. So this is something probably that will only lessen over a long period of time. And I think that's fine, and that's to be expected. And yeah, just something we need to practice with. So that was the last question for today. I hope you enjoyed this sutta with all these very colorful and vivid similes. Try to remember them, or at least a few of them. Try to reflect a little bit on these similes. Of course, probably you won't be able to enter the immaterial stages right away, but slowly and surely we can build up our practice by reflecting properly on those attachments that we have. So for now, we will end with 3 sadhus. Feel free to join if you like. Sadhu, sadhu, sadhu. Have a good day and have a good rest of the week. And I will see you all next Tuesday.